Guys who's a regular reader here asked me to do more on Detroit, Michigan, and on this guy, Little Sammy Finazzo, Salvatore Little Sammy Finazzo. So here you go. I'm sorry I don't have your name. It's downstairs, but sorry about that. You probably don't want your name over this anyway. Anyway, he was born in Sicily in 1907. He arrived in the U.S. in 1908. He was a pretty good welterweight fighter in his day. He had a solid reputation. Later, he would open a boxer's gym in Detroit called the Motor City Boxing Gym. It was a legendary place. And he also ran his regular rackets, crime rackets, and legitimate businesses out of there as well. He held, obviously, incredible sway over Michigan's prize fighting industry. But the day-to-day operations for that were handled by a guy named Billy Gutz, who was born in Gutzi. He was Fenzano's driver, his bodyguard when he needed it, but mostly he trained fighters. He managed their careers, including boxer Lindell Holmes, who was world champ, and Bernard the Bull Benton, also world champ. Gutz was Finazzo's representative to New York, the boxing king, Blinky Palermo, and then of course Frankie Carbo. Also, this enforcer named Joe Berardo, uh, who, wow, he was said to use slingshot, bucket of bolts, and a frying pan on his victims. Worked for Finazzo for about 20 years. He also worked for a gangster named Peter Cavataio. On August 7th, 1944, there was a prize fighter named Eddie Sarkassian. He went into the Villanova Cafe on 2959 Woodward Ave in Detroit, which is owned by Finazzo. That's where he also worked out of. He wanted to confront Finazzo over something. I'm not sure what. It's a confusing issue. Finazzo had sent word that Sarkassian needed to be careful, and that's interpreted two ways: be careful, you might get hurt, or be careful, I'm going to hurt. Anyway, so before Sarkassian left the house, he told his wife they'd been married 2 months. Locked the door. He handed her several $100s. He said, "Don't open it for anybody but me until I get back." He took a pearl-handled revolver, put it in his pocket, and left. So at the bar, he walked up to Finazzo. There was a conversation that delved into a screaming match, and then Sarkassian stormed out of the bar. At around 11 that night, police found Sarkassian's body. He was bullet-riddled, stretched out in front of his sedan. A few hours before, the police inspector, John Whitman, got a call from someone who said, "You better pick up Eddie Sarkassian, because if you don't, you'll find him full of lead." Well, it was too late for that. The first suspects in the killing were several bookies that had been held up at gunpoint, probably by Sarkassian. There was a citywide roundup of all the bad guys they could find, but in the end, the case was closed. There simply wasn't a hint to go on. Gangsters Harry Fletcher and Nilo Mantini, who were very close friends of Sarkassian, the police learned from them that the bookies who were robbed by Sarkassian were paying protection money to Finazzo. That probably sparked that murder. Finazzo came up there in Prohibition. He was a known murderer for hire, a bootlegger, and then he fell under Detroit's founding father, Vito Black Bill Tocco. Peter Licavoli and Joe Zarella, who was Finazzo's brother-in-law, he'd married Zarelli's sister in 1922, guided along his career. On October 4, 1934, there was this wealthy gambler, Jimmy Hayes, sort of one of those bigger-than-life people. He operated a casino near Harbor Springs, Michigan. But anyway, he was murdered with a shotgun and left dead in an alley. He had been murdered apparently by the way, by 26 slugs were fired at close range somewhere else, and then probably a speakeasy. I'll get to that in a moment. And then they drove him someplace and dumped him in an alley downtown Detroit. Hayes had built up this huge nightclub during Prohibition. It was ending. He built this huge nightclub casino business in the Toledo area. And this guy, Yanni Licovelli, the brother of Pete Licovelli, wanted it for himself. Licovelli flooded the area with slot machines and to replace Hayes machines. But Hayes was politically connected. Toledo was this sort of a small town mentality as far as that thing went. And they just didn't want Licovelli there. Hayes was their guy. They were going to go with him. the authorities really cracked down. They leaned on Licavelli, and maybe in retaliation, I don't know, Licavelli put a contract in on Hayes' life, maybe. But it looks like there might be another explanation here. Hayes had bet heavily on the World Series that fall with Gangster Tony had bet, and he lost. And then he apparently reneged on the payment. So Hayes was in Detroit to watch the game. And last night he went to this bar at 138 West Columbia. Today, I looked on a map today, across from 138 West Columbia is a place called Bookies. That's interesting. Anyway, the bar belonged to a bait, who was a bootlegger and a whiskey smuggler at that point. And Sam Finazzo worked there, supposedly as a bartender. I don't know about that. After the police found Hayes' body, Finazzo and the bait got locked up because the cops were given a hint that they were behind it. At the trial, Abate admitted that Hayes had been in the club, but he said he didn't kill him. The prosecution couldn't prove the case one way or another. It went on for a long, long time. There was a witness, a 20-year-old girl named Beth Royce. She stood up in court and she pointed at Abate and Finazzo, and she said there was a loud argument about the World Series, and I heard Abate say, "Someone has to pay." I turned around and I saw Finazzo strike Jimmy Hayes near the eye. Soon after, I heard the shots. Mr. Abate stood up at one end of the bar. There were two shots in rapid succession. Mr. Abate had a handkerchief or napkin over his hand, and there was smoke coming from there. Royce added later that Abate said to Finazzo, "Let's get him out of here," and that Abate and several other guys picked him up, took him out the back door, tossed him in a car, and that's probably when they dropped him off. In December of 1996, Harry Millman, who was a problem child with the Purple Gang, he strutted drunk. He was drunk a lot, apparently, into Finazzo's Cafe. It was a different place on 8th and 4th Street in Detroit looking for a problem. Well, Millman was this big hulking guy. He was an enforcer for the Purple Gang. They said that when he wasn't drunk, but unfortunately he was drunk a lot, he was a likable, gargacious guy. But when he was sober, he was just unpredictable, a mean drunk, basically. Millman despised the mafia, the local mafia. I don't know, who knows why, maybe he had a reason. Anyway, he shook down their brothels, he busted into their nightclubs, he punched around their customers. He really put a stress on the relationship, which was fairly cordial, between the Purple Gang and the Detroit Mafia. So Millman's latest move was this attempt to take over Detroit's policy rackets, which was then under the control of Joe Scarface Bomarito, who was also a brother-in-law of Pete Licavelli. The cafe where he walked in was a hangout for Detroit's Underworld and also for Bomarito. So Millman confronted Bomarito. They had a fist fight. Bomarito, Pete Licavelli, and Beach Bum Joe Massai, who were the crime family's representatives, who was the crime family's representative in Florida for 40 years, had been steadily muscling in on Detroit's labor rackets, including Local 299, which is where Jimmy Hoffa worked. He was a young guy who worked as a clerk. When Millman tried to move in on several of those locals, it didn't go well. The fight in Sam Finazzo's beer garden was just the beginning of all this. In the spring of 1937, Millman got word that Bomarito was getting a shave and a manicure at an Oakland Avenue barbershop in Detroit. He walked into the barbershop. Bomarito stretched out in the chair. He had a hot towel on his face. Millman lifted the towel off his face and spat in his face. Well, at that point, Abe Birdstein, who was leader of the Purple Gangs, he apologized to the mafia. He said, "Look, this guy is not with me anymore. He's not under my protection. Do what you got to do." So on the evening of August 28, 1937, Millman took out Hattie Fletcher. She was the wife of Purple Gang Lieutenant Harry Fletcher, who was in prison. I think he was in Alcatraz. They arrived at the 1040 Club at 1040 Wayne Street in downtown Detroit. Millman was at the club, stayed there after Hattie left. When he left the bar, he handed his keys, it was a brand new coupe, to Willie Holmes, who was a doorman, and told him to fetch his car. When Holmes started the car, it exploded and killed him instantly. Well, at that point, somebody just said, "Look, this has got to end." So they got hold of the Mafia Commission. They, in turn, got hold of murdering killers Harry Strauss, Harry Maone, They found Millman in the early morning hours at Bosky's Restaurant Deli. The killers walked into the bar and just wordlessly took out a 38 and a 45 and shot Millman 10 times. Inadvertently, they shot another guy that killed him, and they shot 3 other people as well by mistake. I assume it was by mistake. A parolee named Charlie, who claimed that Finazzo had paid him to shadow Millman and then to lead those 2 guys to where they murdered him. In 1940, Finazzo's club, the Adrian Gardens, was raided by state police. They arrested 87 people at the scene. Wow. They held them. They had to pay a $3 fine for gambling and drinking and so on. The cops smashed up 2 gambling tables, and they seized 131 cases of beer and several boxes of whiskey. In 1941, Finazzo, Lyle Hartrick, who was a handbook operator, Isidore Green, the policy operator, political boss Smokey Solomon, Solomon represented the black neighborhood, Edward Pulowski, were accused of paying protection money to this Mayor Kaner of Detroit. Finazzo was fined and sentenced to 90 days in jail for contempt of court. He refused to cooperate with the grand jury looking into the bribery charges on any level. During the hearing, Finazzo was asked to name the mayor, who everyone knew was a very bright, very bribable guy. And Finazzo said with a grin that he couldn't do it. It was privileged information by him and his legal team. When asked if he knew who was the equally bribable police commissioner, he said, some guy named Higgins or Piggins. Finazzo also refused to reveal the location of Detroit City Hall. He said that was privileged information between him and the judge and his son. Anyway, the judge said that Finazzo's, quote, disrespect to the court through a hostile and antagonistic attitude was a jailable offense, and he jailed him. In late 40s, very early 50s, Finazzo and Raphael Cusarano, they call him Jimmy Q, Jimmy the Goon, started making very frequent trips overseas. Boss Vittorio Don Vito Vital of the town of Partinico. Between late 1940 and until about 1970, Jimmy Q, along with gangster Frankie Three Fingers, wow, Capola, what a great name, and Papa John Prizzola, made themselves into a top international drug trafficking ring. They supplied Big John Ornamento dope for his criminal empire in Harlem, where he was pushing dope all over the place. In 1975, Jimmy Q would become a prime suspect in the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, who was his friend, a longtime friend. They once shared interest in a boxer together. So, Finazzo's son, who was a Teamster employee, was indicted and convicted in 1960 for sent 3 years behind bars. On May 28, 1960, he was accused by federal agents of having 1/10 of an ounce of pure heroin on him. So in 1965, Finazzo was in Canada for some reason, but they arrested him and they threw him out. And they called him a person prohibited from entering Canada on the grounds of moral turpitude. So Finazzo and Dominic Licovelli were indicted on April 9, 1975 on bribery and conspiracy charges. They were convicted in 1981, sent to prison for 3 years. In that case, Licovelli and Finazzo were middlemen in this scam that involved the Small Business Administration contract kickbacks, and they tried to bribe an SBA official, very high up SBA official. Actually, there were a lot of scams, I remember in those days. The SBA was just filled with money. It was pouring it all over the place. They may have been caught, but a lot of other people weren't stealing from that operation. Anyway, Finazzo died in 1991 at age 86. His son died 2 years later. I checked because Finazzo's wife's maiden name was Jana. I thought maybe she could be related to the Chicago Janas, but she isn't. Her
Bye.